You're welcome to stay, Pastor. I know people are grabbing lunch and slowly filtering back in, but we're going to get started here. So welcome, everyone, to our Peace Workshop. Today, we have the city manager of Cambridge in the house with us. Kind of a long time coming. When I heard that Huang was the new city manager, we were like, man, we got to get this guy in here so we can connect with him and talk with him. Not only is he our city manager, he's a brother in Christ. He worships at High Rock Arlington, which is part of the ECC, the same denomination that we're a part of. And he is so busy, but we are so grateful that he was able to make time in his schedule here today to meet with us. Today we're going to have two people moderating the conversation as well. And so Laura here on this side and Hoy, they've agreed to moderate the conversation. And they'll explain a little bit more about the format and Q&A and all that stuff as we go. Before we start, can I pray for us? We'll go right in. God, we thank you for today. We thank you that we get to be here. We thank you for our brother, Huang. Grateful for him. Grateful for his spirit. Grateful for his service, his friendship, and his willingness, Lord God, to come here to connect with us. So be with us here in this space. We pray this, Lord, in your name. Amen.
So you'll see on the slide there is a QR code, and you can submit any questions that you have that you'd like to ask of Huang to the Slido deck there. And we may not be able to get to all of them. We may be selective as to which ones we like and don't like. You will also have the opportunity to ask any questions towards the end of our time together, as there's a mic down on the floor, and we'll pass that around if there are any questions you'd like to ask in person.
Yeah, well, with that, we can get into just asking some kind of introductory questions just to get to know who is Huang and what is a city manager, and then we'll be getting into some of the topics that people on the forum we sent out last week said they really want to hear about. Huang talk about what topics in Cambridge are relevant to our church. So thank you so much for being here, Huang. First of all, I'd love for you to just share a bit about what your background is and what your career journey has been that led you to become Cambridge City Manager.
Okay, there we go. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here. And so I grew up in the area. I grew up in Lexington, and ended up kind of on a long journey trying to figure out what to do with my life. Started mostly on a trajectory toward doing work in global health and development, and so that was kind of what I really got pulled into when I was in college. And spent a little bit of time doing consulting with nonprofits, foundations, corporations, and then my wife and I, we got married, spent a year in Western Kenya doing work with the Global Health Organization, and then came back and was looking for something to do more locally. I definitely felt the pull of wanting to be closer to the communities that we were serving. I think there was a feeling of sitting in a conference room in a big foundation talking about how we were helping folks that we weren't really connected in relationship with. So I ended up at Boston Medical Center, which is the big safety net hospital in our region, and I was there for 10 years. So really saw the whole journey in terms of a financial turnaround, an operational turnaround, how we serve patients better. And then when this job came up in Cambridge, had been living in the city for a very long time, as part of this community that my kids were going to be shaped by, that my kids were going to grow up in, and got really interested in saying, how can I contribute? So I ended up applying. The city manager is sort of a job where you submit a resume and then you interview with the city council. So there are some aspects of that are normal, like a normal job, and then other aspects that are very different. But I ended up getting picked, and so that was about 3 years ago.
We have a question that came in that's a very similar question that's actually on our script of questions as well. And so this person asks, how does your personal faith influence how you approach your day-to-day responsibilities as city manager, if at all?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, I do think there are. So maybe should I cover like a little what the city manager is?
Oh, yeah, that would be great. Yeah.
So Cambridge has a very interesting form of government. I think the most typical form of government for cities that we're all familiar with is there's a mayor, and you essentially have a mayor that runs for office. They get selected, and then they run the city. And there's also a city council that passes laws and has to approve the budget, but really all the power sits with the mayor. In Cambridge, what we have is 9 city councilors that are elected at large, and so it's actually a very diverse and representative body across the city. And then those 9 city councilors hire a city manager. And then the city manager runs the city, all the departments report to the city manager. And it's an interesting trade-off because you really put executive power within a professional, more apolitical position. And the trade-off, for me, the benefit, and I love this, I don't have to run for office. I don't have to campaign. I don't have to fundraise. I don't have to be part of that. And there's sort of pluses and minuses to that. But the difference is also then the council ends up being the ultimate political authority. So they set direction. They make a lot of the hard decisions. There's always a little bit of that tension around, who's making decisions, how are decisions getting made, and that's been something that continues to be a big part of the discussion in Cambridge. But in terms of my day-to-day, it is essentially police department, fire department, public works, planning, everything in the city rolls up to the city manager, and then I try to keep things running well, implement new initiatives, and help the council figure out what are the different things we want to do, what are the new things we want to do. So that's the job.
Yeah, thanks for explaining that. That actually leads really well into a question that was submitted in our QR code last week. Someone asked, if I live in Cambridge and I want something to change, how do I make that happen? Should I email you? Should I talk to city council? What is the structure, and what is the best thing for an individual person to do?
Yeah, that's such a good question because that is like a question at the heart of government, right? How do we have a voice? How do we make changes? I think if there are small things that should just be fixed, those are very easy things to reach out directly to the city on. So if there's a pothole, if there's a trash pickup that got missed, some of those basic things. There's actually an app called See Click Fix, and so you can put it on your phone, take a picture, say, this garbage can is overflowing, and then it goes directly to the city, and they'll send someone out and fix it. So the small things, I think, are very easy to go directly to the city on. I think in terms of the larger political decisions, those really are things that we tend to people just email everybody. So it's like I get a lot of emails and then the whole city council is copied. I think that on the political decisions, if we want the city to approach bike lanes differently, if we want to change how we're enacting policies on climate change, a lot of those do end up running through the city council. And so that tends to be where more of the debate sits. And so councilors will put in policy orders, they'll debate them, there'll be an interaction with the city where we'll talk about it. When things are working really well, I think we usually come to some sort of a consensus. So the ideal is that some idea comes out and then you have a majority of the council and you have the city administration flesh out the details and say, this is a direction we could go. This is what we could do. This is how much it would cost. This is how long it would take. And then we go and we do it. I think where it gets harder is when either the council doesn't agree or where the council sort of agrees, but the city doesn't really agree. And then that's where we're hashing things out every Monday night.
So you did talk a little bit about the role of a city manager, and a good question that was asked was how is that different differ to the role of the mayor? And then kind of going back, I know you're not a politician, but you didn't answer the question that was asked earlier.
Yes.
Which is, how does your faith influence your day-to-day role?
Yes. So the mayor in Cambridge is selected by the city council. So city councilors are elected, and then after they're elected, the first meeting they have in the year, they vote and select a mayor among them. They also vote a vice mayor. So the mayor holds mostly ceremonial powers, and then chairs the council meetings. And so there's a fair amount of political power in chairing the meeting. The mayor appoints committee chairs. And then the mayor has a stronger political voice, obviously, in debates that are happening, is very present and really represents the city at a lot of different community events. But then in terms of setting policy, the mayor has one vote. And so I think the mayor ends up feeling probably a little closer to a council president, but has the title, and that comes with its own political power. In terms of my faith, I think there has been a real sense, especially when things have gotten really difficult or we have a really hard decision. I do feel like there's something to come back to, to say that this job is not the thing that defines me. That I think I have felt this more because when I was working at Boston Medical Center, it is not a public role, and even the work that Boston Medical Center does, it's a very important institution, but it doesn't really have a lot of that public profile, public exposure. And I maybe under-anticipated how much that was the case with this job. But I think in that sometimes harsh light, there is a bit of saying, well, how do we make decisions? There is something higher that I'm aspiring toward in terms of the values that I'm trying to follow, or the ways that I'm trying to make those decisions, rather than being, really consumed by well, what is everybody going to think? What's the bad news article going to be like? I think there is something that you can fall back to.
Yeah, I really like that you explained the interactions between the city council and the city manager. I'm especially curious to hear what that looks like when maybe the city council votes on something after lots of public input and public comment and gives you a plan, but then maybe the plan has more complications, or as you start doing things, you find out more, and then there has to be, it's not just a one-directional interaction of them giving you a plan. There's also a back and forth that's two ways. Could you share more about has that happened? Is that common? And what does that look like?
Yeah, I think that happens all the time on a lot of the really contentious issues. I don't know how many people are following bike lanes in Cambridge. So that might be a really good example where I think the most recent conversation was about Garden Street. And so for those who are driving around Cambridge, about 3 years ago, Garden Street is part of the bike lane project, and there was a lot of community engagement. The city, as I was literally just coming in, it was my second month, city had essentially talked with people along Garden Street in the neighborhood and decided that in order to preserve more parking on street, we were going to make Garden Street one way. And so now you have to go up Concord. Garden Street only comes toward Harvard Square. That led to a lot of contentiousness. Maybe that's an understatement, because a whole bunch of traffic ended up moving into neighborhoods. It took a while for us to fully do some mitigation, understand what the patterns were going to be. There was a big uproar right in the first 6 to 9 months. There was a big council vote to say, should we change that back? The council at that time said, no, let's leave it as it is. And then more recently, the council came back and said, well, now we have different councilors. We'd like to revisit that, and now we really want to say, let's change it back. Let's make it two-way. And so the city said, okay, if you want to make it two-way, we'll come up with some options. And within the contours of having a separated bike lane, here are some options, right? You could have a two-way bike lane. We'd lose some parking, but you would be able to have two-way traffic and still have a separated bike lane. So we brought that forward. Again, it is interesting because this is the issue that will bring out the most number of people to city council meetings in Cambridge. And, in some ways I understand that, because this is the thing that affects people's day-to-day lives. It is what you see on the street. It's whether you feel like you can have a place to park. It has to do with people who are biking, people whose kids are biking. So we had hundreds of people write in and be involved in that conversation. And the city council ended up voting 5-4 and saying, let's restore two-way traffic. We'll have a two-way bike lane. And that's where some of the complexity was, because the council will often say, well, what does the city think? What do the professionals think? And we really did end up saying, look, we said that we felt like a one-way street design with separated bike lanes on both sides was the best option. We still think that, but ultimately, if the council wants something different, we recognize that this is a political decision. We have sketched out an option that we can all live with. It's not what we would choose, but if the council wants to go in that direction, we'll do it. So that's what the vote was, and I think that's meant to be implemented next year. So we'll see. I mean, this is also, there's a little bit of trepidation because it's like, what happens if next year the council's like, no, we want to change our mind again. So we'll just have to see how that goes.
Yeah, it doesn't surprise me that these issues that affect people who live in the neighborhood, those are the type of things you're going to see the greatest turnout for, right? And a good segue into a question that came in from the audience here is certainly there are neighborhoods in the city that are more well-known as others, right? The MIT, Harvard areas, but I'd imagine that there are areas of the city that are a little more overlooked, maybe even potentially neglected. Do some of those come to mind, and what could the community do to bring more of a voice to their needs?
I think in some ways, because Cambridge is so tightly packed, I do actually feel like for the most part, the neighborhoods are pretty well represented, at least in the political conversations. And I certainly think over the years that has happened more and more. I think there has been a stronger policy impact towards saying how do we have the city direct more resources towards parts of the city that maybe historically didn't get them. When I think about like sewer separation and flooding, there's been tremendous investments in the Port neighborhood, in Alewife, where as recently as I think 2006 there were enormous floods, and the city's put a lot of work in essentially these giant boxes underground that will store water during a rainy season and ensure that it won't flood as often. So I think some of that is happening. I mean, in terms of politically, I would say it has been interesting to feel like we haven't had a lot of Hispanic Latino voices, I think, coming out in public discussions. I think that community hasn't been as represented in the community organizations, in the public dialogue. So I feel like that's one of the areas where that's been the most surprising to me.
Yeah, I was really curious by how you talk about bike lanes being like the hot issue that the people are excited about. Because one of the questions we wanted to ask you is, with more of like a bird's eye perspective, and like, what are the issues that you care about, and especially what are the issues that motivated you to get into this job?
Yeah, I think in terms of the policy conversations, I've been very grateful for the council, for the community, in terms of feeling like actually we're sort of moving in the right direction on all of these things. There are these very difficult debates, but by and large we have been doing more and doing it faster than most of our surrounding communities. When you think about housing, transportation, climate, on all of those, I can talk a lot about how we've made significant efforts, and more so than I think other communities. I mean, I think what really drew me in, and I think what I've really been working on, is mostly actually the governance side. I think that has been the side that sort of felt like it was the most broken when I was coming in. Some of that was COVID. It was just like everybody was online, nobody was seeing each other in person, relationships were more broken. But I think, I came in after, so the longtime city manager, Bob Healy, he started working for the city even before this, but he was hired as city manager in 1981. That was 1 year before I was born. And he was city manager until 2012. And so he was city manager for 31 years. When he retired, his deputy, who had worked with him for decades, became city manager. And when Rich Rossi retired, Louis DePasquale, who had been the longtime finance director, took over as city manager for about 6 years. And so, all three of them really did a lot of amazing things really well. I think Cambridge has run professionally, and you've seen that in terms of a lot of the work that's happened in the city. But I do think that the dynamic between the city council and the city administration is like evolving. And with new councilors who want to see change happen more quickly, there was this push and pull that needed some amount of attention. And so I feel like we're still on that journey. You know, when you talk to city councilors, I think they will say there's still work to be done. But we're trying to make it more clear both to the council and then also the community. You know, how are we making these decisions? Why are we making them? Where does power really sit? Trying to make that more transparent is a big part of what I think both got me excited about coming into city government and I think what I've tried to do.
So as you look at the landscape of all the issues that are present in the city of Cambridge, and this comes in from the audience, what issues do you wish that there was a little more community engagement on?
Oh, that's very interesting. Like, what issue we wish there was more community engagement on? I mean, I think I would say like the issue that I am probably worried about the most is just housing costs. So that comes up, affordability of housing comes up every year on our resident survey. It's by far the most important issue. It's like 40% of people say like that's the number one issue, and the next one's like basically nobody's that worried about. So I think that's the thing I'm most worried about. I do think there's actually quite a lot of engagement on that. There could, I think, always be a little bit more, but I feel like housing policy, and we can certainly talk more about that, feels like the thing that every big city is trying to figure out, especially on the coasts. I think in terms of issues that don't get enough attention, I do think that community violence, gun violence, is something that we see in Cambridge, but it's at sort of a low enough level that you're not having the same conversation that you're having in Boston. But I think this church certainly has experienced that. I mean, the location just being right here next to Green Street, the way I kind of look at it is every year over the last 5 or 10 years, we see about 0 to 2 homicides and about 10 to 15 shootings. And that's fairly consistent. So it's sort of like a low enough number that people, by and large, aren't really worried about it day to day, aren't thinking about it. It's not so significant that we have community organizations forming to really think about how we're engaging with youth. But then at the same time, it's high enough that like I know I'm gonna have 2 to 3 community meetings a year after a shooting to bring people together because they're surprised. They're like, what just happened? Like, how did this happen here? And we usually try to at least create space to then say, okay, like, here's where we are, here's the data, this is what we know, this is what we're doing about it. But I think I don't actually see a lot of engagement, partly because it's not so big a problem, but then when it happens, and it always does, people come out and they say, oh, now we're really thinking about it, so.
Yeah, that makes sense. Affordable housing is something that you're affected by on the daily, right? Versus, something like more of the violent crime is not a daily occurrence. In what ways do you think the community can be more involved in really pushing that agenda further forward in affordable housing?
Yeah, in affordable housing, I would say that I think that having a willingness to do things differently is maybe the big push in terms of changing housing policy. And there's sort of like a broad story in terms of the challenge with building housing is that everybody thinks that more housing should be built, just not next to them. And we've then developed a lot of ways to not build housing. There's like a veto around every corner. So I think there has been just incredible work on the city council to move different policies that make it easier to build affordable housing, so housing that's income restricted, but then also housing in general. So we just passed a major multifamily housing rezoning, and so within all of our residential districts, you can now build up to 4 stories as of right. A lot of the dimensional requirements that essentially meant that even if you could build more, you couldn't because you got too much floor area. Those were stripped away. I I think that's actually one of the most progressive zonings we've seen across the country, and we'll see if it's enough. But those are really hard debates, and I think there are a lot of folks who are very worried about, a tall building going up next to them, and I think that's very human. I would say one of the more surprising conversations I had is I think folks know the Manning Tower that's right around the corner. This is I think it's like a 17 or 19-story building that is affordable housing for seniors and the disabled. It's an amazing project. Cambridge Housing Authority built it. And there was some conversation about using city properties to build more affordable housing. And we had conversations, should we move the Central Square Library? We could then build another tower of affordable housing. And as soon as folks got that, suddenly every city councilor got called. I ended up going to the Manning Tower, and there was a big community meeting where they were like, you cannot build a tower next to us. It would be too much density. It would block our sunlight. And I'm like, I'm literally in a 19-story building that is blocking sunlight for other people. You have housing because we were able to do this project. But it's really human to I think, not want to see something happen next door. And that's a piece that's difficult in Cambridge because everything is next door. We're a very dense city.
Yeah, that really leads into one of the questions I had written, because I really supported the zoning proposal to allow for 4-story buildings, but at the same time, I rent in an apartment building where I just found out from my landlord one of the reasons he might be selling is because the new developer wants to build the building higher and now is asking everyone to leave. And I found housing, so I'm okay, but it feels kind of ironic that I'm kind of losing my housing for the proposal to create more housing. And yeah, I'm just curious how you as a city manager and the city in general approach just looking out for the people that may have their lives disrupted in the short term for the policy that does better for everyone in the long term. How do you make sure those people feel seen and heard and cared for?
Yeah, I think that's really hard. I think there have been some attempts, and this is the challenge because it can be really hard to do. There are sometimes opportunities to take those developments and essentially turn them into actual affordable housing, right? Income restricted. It often depends on whether the people living there would qualify if that were to happen. But I definitely think that is one of the biggest challenges where, on the one hand, I do think that the push for more housing production is one where there's a lot of risk because new housing production is going to be built for the top of the market. And it will be a question of whether some of the turnover ends up actually pulling more affordable, middle income stock out of the market, which isn't good. At the same time, one of the biggest challenges is if there isn't more housing production, we kind of know where this story is going to go. Housing costs are only going to go up. It is literally just like a supply-demand mismatch. And so I think that's why we're seeing I think very appreciate Governor Healy. She has made this a huge push to kind of address at a regional level and say we really need more housing production, not just in cities like Cambridge that are more willing to pursue progressive housing policy, but we need it everywhere. And I think that really is where you're going to have to see action more broadly in order to get the kind of production that would actually bring down prices. I mean, that is my biggest fear, that you have developers who say, especially given this environment where costs are increasing, the thing that's going to make them build more housing is higher rents, and that's terrifying to me to think that actually we're sort of moving in the wrong direction on that front.
What restrictions, if any, do new developers have in building just brand new housing altogether? And does that pose some hurdles to providing the kind of housing the community needs?
Yeah, I think the biggest problem right now is just the economics of construction. When you look at projects that happened in 2018, 2019, before the pandemic, none of those projects work now because the cost of labor has gone up, the cost of supplies and construction has gone up, interest rates are significantly higher. And so that's one of the challenges that we're facing in terms of the production environment. And I think certainly it's on the agenda on Monday night. There's a policy order to discuss, why the economics of new housing production don't work and what we can do about it. So I would say very grateful to the community and the council. Like, there is a real grappling with this at a very nuanced level. And, there's the politics of it. And if you're on like Reddit, you'll sort of see, actually Reddit's like more nuanced than I ever thought it was. But there is some like polemical conversation, but by and large, I've actually seen like a very nuanced policy-focused conversation that kind of understands that there's not like a silver bullet here.
Yeah, I've also been very pleasantly surprised by Cambridge subreddits.
Very surprising.
I love that when you're talking about housing, you talk about it holistically too, not just like the Cambridge border, because it's just, a line on a map, but really housing is affected from a lot of different places, and a lot of issues are affected by our neighboring communities. So one of the questions I had was around, just the interactions between municipalities and also businesses. I think we've talked about the interactions between your department and the city council. But I know a lot of policies are affected by businesses, by Boston, maybe by religious organizations. I heard that the Cambridge Warming Center was funded heavily by local businesses to try to help people who are on the street have somewhere to go that is warm. And then they found out that actually after they created the warming center, there were more people on the street, which seemed kind of backwards. And some research showed that it's because people from Boston who didn't have anywhere to go were coming into Cambridge because we had ways to care for them, which I would argue is a good thing, but a lot of businesses didn't quite see it that way. Could you talk about just those interactions between Cambridge and Boston, Cambridge and businesses and churches?
Yeah, of course. So I think across municipalities, there's definitely healthy and good conversations. There's things that we've pursued together. We are doing work on supplier diversity. And so if you look at like where the city spends money, we sort of have historically just spent with the vendors that we've always worked with. There was a study that we did and then found that very, very few minority women-owned businesses were receiving money from the city, which was, the numbers were a little bit shocking, but also the conclusion maybe wasn't that surprising. And one of the things we did is instead of like create our own certification process, which is very cumbersome, we actually reached out to Boston. They'd already created one, and we said, well, why don't we just use the same one? And so we signed an agreement with them, and that way anybody that's already certified in Boston, because we're not only buying services from vendors in Cambridge. Cambridge is not actually that big. But now any vendor that gets certified in Boston also qualifies for Cambridge. And so I think there's things that we can do together. I would say some of it is like, though the politics are actually very like local. And so while nobody who lives in Boston or Cambridge is thinking about the border, all the politicians and city workers kind of are, because that's their job. Like, once it crosses the border, it's sort of like not your problem. So I think I wish that there was more of that regional view. That's really where the state comes in. And maybe that's the segue on, I would say homelessness is one of these deeply regional issues. And I think because our cities are so much smaller than in other parts of the country, that's even more the case. And so the warming shelter, which actually I think is fully funded, it's fully funded by the city. I do know that the Business Improvement District and some of the local businesses did help advocate for it. But when there is capacity at a shelter, it's a regional system. It is not a city system, and so there's a lot of people who will be in Boston or Somerville and end up in Cambridge. Some of that is because we have a very significant concentration of adult shelter beds, specifically in Central Square. I think across the city, we have about 300 homeless shelter beds. Maybe like more than 2/3 of those are here, like within this like couple block radius. Somerville has like 20 beds total across the entire city. So I think some of that is just, the regional nature of homelessness means if somebody needs a bed, they're going to find one. And if they have to drive a mile and a half and cross a bridge, then that's what'll happen. And I think we've definitely taken the approach of saying we're not going to change the character of who we are. I think that's a lot of what Central Square has always been, a place where people can come and receive services. But then we are also trying to figure out, like, how do we manage that? How do we ensure that Central Square is a place where your family can walk around, your kid can go to Taekwondo? That's something we've really been working on as well, since I think the pendulum probably swung too far in the other direction, where it was sort of like the police, really was true. Like, for many years, the police felt like they couldn't do anything, and I think we've been slowly moving that toward a place where the police and our outreach workers can set clear expectations and say, look, like, you're allowed to hang out in public spaces, but if you're doing things you really shouldn't be doing in public, then you gotta move that somewhere else.
Yeah, thanks so much for adding clarity to that. Another question that came in this week was also asking around related to these social issues like homelessness. How can churches partner with the city? And I think I looked up, there are about 40 places of worship across Cambridge, and a lot of them are actually Christian churches. What do you think is the role that churches should play in the Cambridge community?
On top of that, I think, this is a question that came in from the audience as well. What are some tangible ways that the Christian community can support those who are experiencing homelessness, who are experiencing, the impact of the political climate because they're immigrants here in the country? If you can speak to that, that'd be great.
Yeah. I think first, there's definitely a fraying of society where I think spaces like this, where people can gather together as a community, I feel like that's shrinking if you compare to 20 years or 40 years ago. I think we certainly feel that in Cambridge, where people are a little more transient already, but then having a place where you're meeting people who might not be in your direct friend group is really important. So I do think that, like, civic space always is a huge part of community, and the more that churches, mosques, temples can feel like that, draw people in, draw the community in, I think that's really important. I think being part of the civic conversation, I don't think churches are typically excited about getting into the political sphere, but even being part of the conversation about different issues facing the city, maybe not bike lanes, but other things, I think that would be great, and I feel like that's super important. And then, I think there probably is, like, especially given the location and the community here, there is, and I know there's a lot of really strong relationships with the Central Square bid, with the city, but we're always very happy and excited to partner about what it means to sort of make spaces feel different, support folks in different ways. And I think if there's avenues for the city to partner or to find others, we would be excited.
Yeah, I really like that you talked about just what the city landscape looks like, especially like as a church in Central Square. We've been having a lot of conversations around what should Central Square look like, especially because it's changing a lot right now with Carl Barron Plaza being renovated, certain businesses switching out, like the Walgreens, and we're trying to think about what how our building and the space around our building can build community. What would be your ideal vision for Central Square in the coming years?
Yeah, I think I would love for Central Square to continue to have that sort of gritty character, to be a place where people can come and find help. I think that's a big part of what it's always been. But I think we also want it to feel like a space that's more alive, and I think Carl Barron Plaza is a great example where, and this is the hard part. It's kind of like, actually, most of the people who were gathering in Carl Barron Plaza before, most of them were not homeless. they might have been formerly homeless, but a lot of them had found housing in permanent supportive housing or other, it's not just the shelter beds that we provide. The city's actually both directly and indirectly been involved in creating a lot of pathways out of homelessness. But folks then still will come out and have community together. How do we find spaces that are appropriate, where we don't want to say people aren't allowed to be in certain places, but where it doesn't create the kind of disruptions, I think that make it harder for businesses to operate, for families to be around. I think there's a question about how we activate spaces in positive ways, in creative ways, and those are all probably important conversations over the next year as Carl Barron Plaza kind of comes back to life.
So other than, making it more pretty than it was before, we have the plaza here in Central Square. We've got the pit in Harvard Square as well. What is and this is kind of a spin-off of a question that came in from the audience, what is the long-term goal of redoing spaces like that for the community?
Yeah, I think the long-term goal is to find some revitalization. I think there is, there's some basic work that also just kind of had to get done under the ground. So a piece of that project wasn't just saying, we have a plaza that needs to be redone. I think there was some real utility work and electrical infrastructure under the streets that was part of that project. And so, I think in Cambridge, we tend to, there is a bit of efficiency there. We also have had the resources to do a great job on these kinds of things. So it's like, look, if we're gonna dig up the street to do a couple of things, we may as well do the things, above the street and next to the street as well. So I think there's a piece of that where we would love to see the whole community be able to use that space in different ways, and I think that's going to be the question. Are we able to find that balance? Are we able to welcome everybody in? And what does that look like? I don't think I necessarily have the full answer to that, but maybe that's the vision.
Yeah, so another question that came in kind of goes well with that is you talked about the city having the funds to do things like that, and certainly operating in the most efficient way possible that a dollar goes further than, as far as it can. Has the city experienced any negative impact from the Trump administration and their federal funding cutback?
We have not seen, I think sort of yes and no. I think we have a couple of smaller grants that we've seen that are probably unlikely to kind of move forward, but we're not quite sure yet. It's still actually both, it doesn't feel early because so much has already happened, but in terms of how the court systems have worked, those actually move on the order of months and years, not days and weeks. And so we're really still waiting to see where a lot of this will land. We're definitely worried. There's a bunch of major federal programs that affect housing, homelessness, that feel like they're likely to be frozen or cut or threatened. And we're tracking where those conversations are. I think we've seen really significant climate resilience related grants cut. The biggest ones really affected Chelsea Everett, and so there are some really significant infrastructure projects that were meant to reduce flooding over the next 50 years, and so there's a $90 million grant that was cut, and so I think we're kind of still watching and waiting, but pretty worried about what's going to happen.
Yeah, well, I guess to circle back to what you were saying about third spaces and what it means to activate a space, I know you shared that you're a member of High Rock Church and can relate to what we're doing here as a church body in a community. I'd love to hear what you think churches should do to make their spaces active spaces where everyone can be engaged and feel welcome.
Yeah, I think Central Square Church has certainly been engaged in the community. The Youth Soccer Nights is an amazing program that happens in the summer. I do think continuing to find ways to intersect with folks in the community, and I think space, especially in Cambridge, is hard to come by, and so welcoming folks in is a great part of that. So, I think those are all really important. I would say, and I don't have the exact answer, but we know that immigration is a huge issue that we're going to see a lot of challenges on. And so between the last 1 to 2 years where we've seen really significant issues with refugees, that's an area where I know individuals within Cambridge, the faith community has done a fair amount of work. And then I think we're definitely worried about what's going to happen with people who are undocumented, who are part of our community, and I think we're going to continue to see different crackdowns from the federal government. I don't have great answers in terms of what that looks like, and I will say that as local and state government, we're going to see real difficulties as we interact with the federal government. That's an area, and we're sort of continuing to have this conversation with the city council. We're giving an update again tomorrow night, but we're seeing the federal government push forward to be more aggressive about trying to say local and state governments are not allowed to even provide benefits to people who are not documented. And that's not something that I think, it's sort of been an understanding that the federal government is the one that's responsible for immigration enforcement, and state and local governments have been allowed to look the other way, to say, this is not our job, it's your job. You don't get to tell us what to do because, these are our resources. But because it's important for all people in our community to be thriving, to be healthy, to come in and get vaccines, to go to school, to show, to testify if there's been a crime, to report domestic violence, like all of those things, we want anybody in our community to be willing to interact with the city, to interact with civil society. I think there's an attack on that, and the worry would be if something changes in terms of how the courts view those separations. And I don't know if that's an area where like third spaces can play, where ultimately, state and local governments are going to obviously fight this in courts where they don't align with our values. But I do worry over time if we lose that battle. And you can sort of see there's been certainly a fair amount of change at the Supreme Court level over the last couple of years.
Yeah, I really appreciate you talking about that. Our last talk like this was specifically on immigration, and I've been really encouraged to see various city councilors advocating, sharing about protests to support immigrants. I also know that Cambridge is listed officially as a sanctuary city. Do you have thoughts on what that will look like this year to be a sanctuary city? That was kind of one of my main questions, is how much can we do to be a sanctuary given federal rulings?
Yeah, I mean, Cambridge became a sanctuary city, used the term, passed the original ordinance in the early 1980s. So this is not a new stance, it's not a new value for the city. I do think the more recent iteration of that was a welcoming cities ordinance, which is more where people are moving the language, though I think it's still complicated. I mean, sanctuary does probably feel further than what we really commit to, just because local governments are not able to obstruct or resist lawful actions that are happening at the federal level. But certainly Cambridge has been very clear that we don't cooperate with federal immigration. We don't share any data. We don't collect any data. And sort of what I was kind of saying before, the value is really to say anybody who's in our community should fully be part of our community. And it's not our job to figure out who's here legally, who's here not legally. We're here to make sure that everybody's thriving. And I think that's the worry, that the federal government is certainly targeting that view and seeking to punish cities, states, counties that are in that place. That's the most recent executive order from last Monday. I think it was in the next 30 days, the federal government is going to list the sanctuary cities and then figure out what kind of funding they want to freeze that is going toward those cities, states, counties. And I'd be shocked if Massachusetts and Boston aren't on the list, and I'd be pretty surprised if we weren't.
Yeah,
Sorry,
thanks for
a little
sharing more
dark.
on that, but I appreciate that. It's very encouraging to know the city is actively planning for this.
Yeah, we're definitely watching really carefully and planning and thinking about the role the city can play, and I think that is, I would say like that is one of the pieces that I feel a lot of people say, well, so what can we do? There's really a hunger to be part of making our community stronger, to be resisting some of the actions that we're seeing out of the federal government that are just really not aligned with our values. And we're certainly thinking about that in terms of our role as a city too.
Yeah, I think pretty soon we can open it up to audience questions with the mic, but I guess before that, I just have one last more forward-thinking question is, what would you like Cambridge to look like at the end of your tenure? And what do you hope for the future for Cambridge?
Yeah, I mean, I really hope that we can continue to have really healthy and constructive political debates. I kind of came in partly because I had also a sense that trust in our local institutions, a sense that our government needs to feel transparent, feel legitimate, that the decisions we're making can be explained. I think that's a big piece of it, right? I feel like if there's anything, there's all these challenges that we're facing. I would love if you know, whenever I move on, we've like solved the housing crisis. I'm maybe not sure if that will fully happen, but then the next best thing would be if we're able to have really productive debates about that, make the right decision, generate the political will to do things that need to be done, but also explain it, because we're not going to all agree on that. And that's a big piece of, I think sustaining our democracy, being able to have people say, okay, look, my voice was heard. I feel like there are these problems that we all agree we want to solve. Maybe it wasn't the solution I exactly wanted, but I felt like I was part of a process. And this decision was legitimate, and I trust that we can move forward. And maybe I stay in the fight. I still don't agree, but that's I think what makes our government work. I think there's all kinds of ways we're seeing where that breaks down, and if we can sustain that at least in this city, maybe that's a small step.
So I know you mentioned there was a See-Click Fix app that members of the community can use to report things like potholes or missed trash pickup. I want you to know I've used that with my kids, and the issues I've seen in their bedroom, it didn't work. But we do have several questions that came in from the audience that are very specific as to certain initiatives and policies. And I think maybe the overall question to be asked here is, what is the most effective way to get those kinds of questions to the attention of those that are empowered to make those kinds of changes?
In terms of like getting answers to questions, or in terms of influencing decisions?
I think
or
they're
both.
asking both.
Yeah. I think writing in, I would say like we have like one of the most responsive city governments than you can possibly imagine. And so I think it is like writing into the city, writing into the city council. We started asking this question. So we do this annual resident survey. We'd always sort of asked like, how many city council meetings have you watched or attended? How many times have you contacted your city councilor? And then the one thing that we started doing is we started actually getting benchmark data. So, we standardized the way we were asking the questions, and then we can look at, how do we compare with 300 other communities around the country. And so we were asking, what percent of a random set of residents who respond to this survey have contacted a city councilor. And it was like 40%. Which put us number 2 out of like 300 communities. So it is actually like an incredibly responsive city government. Make your voice heard, and really like city councilors, they'll call you back. If you get in touch with them. The good part is you've got 9 counselors, and so one of them will pick it up. And I think this is very different than if you've got like a district counselor who in some ways is going to be responsive because they've only got like a small neighborhood. But then if they don't like you, or if they don't think that you're their voter, you might not really be represented. I think what's amazing about Cambridge is like, hey, I guarantee you one of those counselors wants your vote. And so you'll find the counselor who lines up with you, that will pick up that torch that you want them to carry, and they'll carry that. And so that's, sometimes that's harder for my job. But I would say it is part of like the beauty of kind of what we've got on Monday nights.
So a question from the audience. You are the first Asian American to hold this position in the city. And we have a number of other pretty prominent Asian Americans here in the local area holding positions of influence. If I can be a little bit candid here, we've heard, I don't know if you are familiar with the stand-up comedian Ronnie Chang, and he talks about the role of Asians in race relations and bridging gaps between communities because they just don't care either way. I don't think that's necessarily true with you. However, the question is, do you believe that being an Asian American in your position affords you any kind of privileges to bridge those gaps, or to be a voice that maybe is heard more so than another?
I think there's some truth there, I think there's some truth there. I feel like everybody though has, I do think like everybody's bringing a really complex and unique set of experiences, characteristics, that will play differently, and so I think some of that also gets to how you find points of empathy and connection with the really diverse community that we have. I think there's a lot of different like directions to go with that, but I definitely feel like there is a sense of there's a sense that it both like matters a ton, and it also like isn't the job, right? The job is just to keep the city running well, to meet people with where they are, understand them, and then help actually get all of our counselors talking productively, hopefully agreeing on something, and then we can implement and move forward. But then, we all know like who we are makes a difference, how we're perceived. I think I certainly have felt that in some different forms, and certainly in like a professional setting. It is often the case that I'm often, I think, the first Asian American that somebody else is working with at a senior level. But I think these are all things that I think deserve a lot of deep attention and thoughtfulness. And then also there's like the job that has to get done.
Well, if we want to open it up to any questions, live questions from the audience, we certainly can take some time to do so.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, for coming and for sharing with us regarding Cambridge. I have been a chairperson of a task force related to housing. Our group arranged to meet with the counselors and later with you. But there are continuing concerns related to housing. You've mentioned about affordable housing, which is obviously one aspect. The one thing that we need to consider is not only affordable housing, which pertains to persons, families who earn $50,000 or more in Cambridge. What about those who don't earn $50,000 and who need housing, which could be up to possibly a half of the population in Cambridge? But more specifically related to affordable housing, I recognize that there are over 20,000 persons on a waiting list for housing here in Cambridge. some of those are people outside of Cambridge. But nevertheless, this points out to the importance of this issue for all of us. Secondly, I recognize that the prior manager arranged to have a restudy of the 10 plots that are currently owned by the city of Cambridge in the Central Square area. And so, my question is, why is the library location the one selected by the Planning and Development Commission of Cambridge, pointed to build more housing on that plot of the current branch library in the next block from us here, when in reality, within this same block of where we are located right now, we already have 3 high-rise apartment dwellings that involve more than 350 units. My question is, why is the library location the prime location when there's already this density in Cambridge? Cambridge is so much more than just Central Square, or even within 1 block of us. Cambridge needs to share in this responsibility of housing all of these people who need housing. And so why is the library location being pushed by planning and development?
Thanks for the question. So maybe I'll do the second part first. So I think we've been actually very clear that the library is not the prime location. We've sort of said that many, many times. It is not being pushed. The library was always actually much further down in terms of many, many years from now. The plot that we were really looking at initially was the H Mart parking lot. So on Bishop Allen Drive, that was the prime location that I think the council was interested in at first, because it's the largest location. I would say that in that study of the 10 lots that the city owns, one of the parts that probably was underappreciated as we were initially having that conversation is parking lots are sort of spaces that aren't being used, but in other ways they're actually being used as parking lots. And so I think my sense is that the desire to develop that plot is more complex than initially when it's sort of like, oh, well, we just have to build more affordable housing, let's put it here. We've actually done a pretty good amount of work to say, look, like this is a very attractive plot of land, the H Mart parking lot. What would it look like? We had developers come in and say, what would they be thinking about? What kind of leasing terms? What would the economics look like? What would it look like given that the community has said we care about affordable housing, we care about arts and cultural space, we still need parking. I think the challenge when we came out of that study was mostly that, as we were kind of talking about, right now the economics of production just mean it doesn't make a lot of sense to try and move forward at this point in time. And there's been a desire to actually look at zoning in Central Square again. And that's something that is likely to get picked up early next year. But the library is not early on the list. It's not something that we're even actively working on right now. It's more that from a long-term planning perspective, and this is actually last term, so it was the last council was kind of saying, oh, well, like the Central Square Library is kind of off the ways. It would be great if we could bring it onto Mass Ave. We could give it more space and expand the library, and that would allow for that space to be developed. But that's way off. I mean, we would have to find a different space. We'd have to relocate the library. I think that that whole idea is really just an idea. It hasn't been sketched out. There's not really concrete plans. It's not something that's been funded. And so, we've sort of been saying that a lot. And I would reiterate that nothing has changed from that position. And I think a lot of what you're pointing to that is the conundrum, right? I think we have a city that's actually incredibly dense. We're one of the most dense cities in terms of people per square mile. And I think this is a bit where it's like, if we can find more opportunity for building housing, that will help. It will make a small difference, but it is ultimately also a regional issue where we're doing our part, but we really need to see more housing production in Arlington, more housing production in Watertown, more housing production in all of our surrounding communities. And I think that is where I feel like the state is very focused, and where some of the policies that we're passing are meant to also guide other communities, make it more plausible for them to take some of these steps. And hopefully over the next 5, 10, 20 years, we'll see more housing production, and that's what's really going to affect long-term the cost of housing.
May I just make a quick response? A friend of mine just in the last 2 weeks shared with me how he was attending a meeting where they were discussing a 12-story building of housing on the library location. Therefore, I will have to consult with him as to where he was to get that information, which is opposing what you just shared.
I'm not aware of that, but yeah, happy if you want to let me know which meeting that was.
Thank you, by the way.
No, of course.
Hi, good afternoon. Thank you for being here. My name is Kim. I'm part of the leadership team for the Cambridge Families of Color Coalition. And one of the issues that we're currently advocating for is a review of the innovation agenda in reference to the middle schools. Unfortunately, many of our middle schools aren't meeting the moment. They're failing our black and brown students, our students on IEPs and 504s, our English language learner students, and our students from low-income families. So I'm just wanting to know from you, would you support a review of the innovation agenda? And secondly, would you be willing to meet with us at some point this month to discuss our advocacy, not only the middle schools, but the whole of CPSD? Thank you.
No, thank you. I would say it's more a conversation with the superintendent and the school committee. I think, I know that you're in various stages of trying to have that conversation with them as well. I'm always, open to different meetings, but in terms of the roles, the city really sets the school budget. We try to make sure that we've given them something reasonable that accounts for a lot of the different contractual growths and growths in programs that the schools need, but we don't really have the authority to kind of go in and review programs or to say, this is what you need to change, especially around educational outcomes. For sure, I think a lot of what you're pointing to is stuff that we can all see, that there are significant disparities that we're seeing in our schools that need more attention. I think that's a really important conversation that I'm hoping, the school committee, the interim superintendent, I know there's a big decision to be made in terms of who the permanent superintendent is going to be, and having a more assertive agenda for how we're going to approach teaching, learning differently. That seems really, really important.
About, I assume that MIT and Harvard own a relatively significant portion of property here in the city.
They do.
Okay. My assumptions are not always correct. Given that they own a significant portion of the property here in the city, how much involvement, whether proactive or responsive, is there from them as institutions in meeting some of these community needs?
I would love more. I think, we've sort of been pretty public about that. I think we are very grateful for the relationship with both Harvard and MIT. They've always been very responsive partners. I think especially during the pandemic, you can point to a number of ways that they were both generous financially, but also in terms of working with the city and the community, they really stepped up. And I think that's always been a really productive relationship. I don't know if there's been a time where our two local universities have been under more stress and pressure than these last 2 years, and I think what we would expect in the next two. And so I have like a deep amount of empathy for what the leadership at both universities are going through, trying to both defend their values and navigate this situation where, as much as I think we feel like the city of Cambridge has to plan for and is going to have to adapt to impacts from federal funding being cut off. I mean, the two universities have been living that already for the last 90 days, and they have much more at stake. You know, in terms of broadly, I mean, we continue to push both universities to build more housing. I think MIT actually has really significant construction of graduate student dorms coming on board. But I think it also comes down to some of these conversations in terms of, you know, Harvard will say, like, that's fine, we're happy to build more housing. The last conversation we had maybe 10 years ago, nobody in Cambridge wanted us to build, you know, tall buildings. So I think some of those conversations are changing and there may be some opening. It's probably just a little hard right now because of the political environment for the universities. But I'm very grateful for Harvard. We sort of got in just before the door shut, and so we were negotiating this pilot agreement, and we were really looking, the university was on board with saying, we want something long-term, we want certainty. We were trying to find a new 20-year deal for a pilot agreement, and recognizing everything that was happening, we said, look, let's just find a one-year deal so we can put it in our budget. Got that agreed to, and then like it was literally like the next week when that first letter arrived. So I was very grateful for the timing, and also just recognize that a lot of what we're trying to do is support the university, make sure that they understand that the community is behind them, and hope that they will stand firm in terms of our collective values and the importance that they play as independent organizations.
Any other questions from the audience?
Quick question. What's the rough quantum of our budget that comes from federal sources as opposed to like taxes and other incidental items?
Yeah, so we have almost $1 billion budget with a B, and then we get $23 million of federal, of sort of like recurring federal grants. So it's actually pretty minor. It's like under 3% of our budget is federal grants. I think the larger impacts are going to be the federal dollars that are flowing to more directly either through the state or directly to organizations that are really important to us. So if you think about the Cambridge Housing Authority, all of the dollars they're getting from HUD, if you think about the nonprofit community, the different federal grants that are supporting their work. So those are sort of numbers that we're not like directly tracking, but we're certainly in conversation with those organizations to understand what they're hearing, policy changes that may be coming down the pike, and to what extent there's a contingency plan to say, if this funding disappeared for this program, what would we do?
CHA non-governmental then, or is it?
The Cambridge Housing Authority is sort of quasi-governmental. So, I mean, they are essentially a public entity. I think that's accurate. So, their board is appointed. I appoint like 4 of the board members. One of the board members is appointed by the governor. And then, essentially they're playing with public dollars.
And they manage like the major, really all the tall buildings effectively in Cambridge, right?
Yes, most of the tall buildings. There's the Cambridge Housing Authority, and then we have 2 affordable housing developers, HRI, and then Just to Start. And so the 2 of them also have different portfolios of essentially affordable housing.
Got it. Thank you.
5 minutes left here, so if there's any deep, burning questions, now's the time to get them in.
My question isn't a deep, burning question, but I was curious about what's next for thinking about Central Square rezoning.
So Central Square rezoning, I think we are continuing to do community engagement about it, and then I think the council, we've gotten more organized with the council, which I've very much appreciated, to say there's a lot of different zoning work to do. It takes up a lot of time from the zoning department, from the law department, and so we've sort of work planned it out with them. There's more of a focus to get the Cambridge Street and North Mass Ave zoning completed in the next 6 months. And then we'll bring forward the Central Square rezoning ideas in sort of January, February. And so, the specific contours aren't yet figured out, but I do think by and large it's saying if we're in the main civic, cultural, business district, how do we create more space to go higher, have more density, but then also think about what does that mean? What's the step back into the neighborhoods? How do we think about the impact on the square and on sort of existing businesses and residents? And so I think there's still actually a lot to get figured out. But overall, the idea is mostly to figure out how you can get more housing, especially because there's not as much, it's very close to transit. And I think the idea is there's going to be more openness to height compared to in a residential neighborhood.
Hello, this is a follow-up to the CHA question because you mentioned you appoint 4 of the board members. So I guess my question is how does someone get entered in the pool to be a board member, and then how do you appoint? What's your process behind appointing board members?
Yes, I think there actually is an application right now. So there's one board seat that's open. The 5 members on the Housing Authority Board. One is appointed by the governor, one needs to be a tenant, one is a labor representative, and then 2 are just sort of folks that we nominate. So it's an application, and then there's interviews. Typically, you've got either the city or the Housing Authority will have some role in being part of that conversation, and then we end up with a short list. We do interviews with the board chair, and then we nominate somebody that then is approved by the city council. So that's the process.
We have time for just one more live audience question, and then I'll take one from the list, and then Laura will close with one. All right. One of the questions that came in was actually I think it was on our list, was the use of surveillance in the city for public security or public safety. Where is the city, and what's the status of that in the conversation in the city council, and what are your thoughts on it?
Yeah, it's definitely shifted a lot. We have one of the strictest surveillance ordinances of any city, and so I think historically Cambridge has been very reluctant to have any sort of surveillance involving the city. I think things have changed with the deployment of cameras everywhere. So, whether it's Ring cameras on people's doors, or if you walk by a Tesla or any normal EV at this point, you are being recorded in all directions at all times. And we've certainly seen that where there was actually a very horrible traffic accident on Putnam maybe about a year ago, where we had some high school students. They were on a moped. They didn't stop at the stop sign. There was a crash. One of the individuals, I think, actually passed away in the hospital afterwards. But we got footage of exactly what happened because there was a Tesla parked about 20 meters away at an intersection and just caught the whole thing. And so, in the aftermath of the accident, when the police were on scene saying, did anybody see what happened? They just downloaded the video from the Tesla and they saw everything that happened. And I think in that context, it's felt more okay to say, look, we have certain parts of our city that we know we need to monitor more closely, where we know that there is behavior that's happening that we don't really support, and where there's real risk for violence or other illegal activity. And then when something happens, we have our police department going around just looking for a Tesla or looking for a Ring camera. And I think we did go to the city council and we said, we should just put up a camera, and then we don't have to ask everybody. At least we'll be able to pull the footage ourselves, and there was a willingness to do that. So I think the ubiquitousness of cameras and footage in the public has made it easier for us to move forward with that. I think certainly deploying body cameras on our police officers was similar, where I think if you go back, 20 years, people would be very nervous about all of that footage, and nowadays it's just widely accepted that you want police encounters to be, to be videotaped. And so, I think some of that is like society has moved so far that it's been easier to say, look, this is a tool, and it will actually help us solve crimes. It will maybe have a deterrent effect. We're hoping we'll sort of see.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing. I guess to close us out, I just want to ask, what is something that you are looking forward to seeing grow or change in Cambridge in the next 2 years?
Oh, that's a good question. I feel like we're kind of just in a defensive posture in the next 2 years, and so I think I feel a little bit of, I don't know, maybe that's worth more thinking, because I think right now, after the first 100 days, a lot of the orientation feels more like, how do we just preserve a lot of what we have, as opposed to what is some dramatic change that we can make. And that's maybe just because it's a bit of a, there's kind of like a dark spirit around as you read the news. But there are really incredible positive things that continue to happen within the city. I think we are making significant strides in terms of housing policy. I think even at the much more local level, what's a great, the urban forestry department is incredible. They've planted more than 1,000 trees a year, and when you walk down the streets, you'll see those little stickers that say a tree coming, coming soon to this place. And so there are all of these things that are happening locally that I think are really incredible. And then we're also trying not to be in a panicked state all the time as we look at what's happening federally.
Well, thank you so much for answering all of our questions.
Thank you so much.